Having, thank you. Having set the context to this conversation and identified a need for having this conversation, right? I'd like to um, ask this question to everyone in this room. Have you felt that the need for a gender inclusive POSH policy is getting increasingly relevant in either your practice as POSH consultants or you being a part of an organization? Do you think that somewhere there is a need with what work you are doing where you have identified that yes, this is something that going forward is going to become extremely important? Maybe as of date, you may not have personally encountered cases, but you are hearing of cases coming up where there the gender inclusive aspect of POSH policies is playing out. So asking all the participants if they've heard of or recognize the need for having gender inclusive POSH policies, or is it something that you're still thinking about whether it really is a need, or is that something that you can put aside and then think about later? Anyone here who's ever heard of a complaint which was filed or which has been raised by someone who does not identify as a woman? Are you aware of experiences of other genders and they may have faced issues with respect to workplace sexual harassment? You can put it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself as well. I'm just going to share my screen. Is my screen visible to everyone? Yes? All right. So, yes, going back to whether, there has been any need from your end, or have you ever heard of complaints being filed by anyone other than a woman within an organization, or if there has been a need? Me as a POSH consultant, in my career so far, yes, it is true that, women primarily are the complainants, and we do receive complaints in large volumes, which are from women people who identify as women. But there have been cases where the gender of the complainant was not a cis woman. And when we talk about them wanting to file a complaint, right? Um, in organizations which have already taken this step, which have already put in that investment, where they have been able to, give the time and effort, they have been able to deal with these successfully, been able to address it successfully, create a sense of psychological safety. But a lot of organizations are not prepared. We will also touch upon the aspect of how a lot of organizations think being gender neutral is enough, right? Just saying that, oh, we have a neutrality towards the gender of the complainant is enough. I want to take it a step forward and a step further and talk about gender inclusivity. What do we mean when we say that we want to move on from gender neutrality to gender inclusivity? So we have a response from Radha. She says, yes, unfortunately, company does not practice gender neutral policy. So in cases like Radha said, if somebody who's not a woman files a complaint and the company does not practice gender neutrality, it is going to sort of give a sense of not being heard to the complainant, not being given the same amount of sensitivity, not being given the same amount of audience. And it is at the end of the day going to have an impact on the trust that the person has in the organization, their level of productivity that they have in the organization, because they're not feeling satisfied with their with the outcome, or they're not feeling a sense of belonging, to put it simply, right? Urvashi says that she has not seen any complaints yet. That's fine, because as I said, most of the complaints that we have are from women, but it does not mean that complaints like this do not arise. We'll discuss with respect to that as well. Why do these complaints do not seem as obvious as the complaints that are filed by women, right? So moving on from the first thing that we want to discuss, before we get into the whole aspect of adopting gender inclusivity within your POSH policy, there are some things that we need to first talk about. First is, what is a gender inclusive POSH policy, right? What does it even mean to have a gender inclusive POSH policy? Second is, why do we need it? Many organizations, even large organizations for that matter, do not think that this is a need, or have not so far felt the need for having a gender inclusive POSH policy. So why do we need it if we have so far not seen any complaints? Third is, when is the right time to implement a gender inclusive POSH policy in an organization? When should an organization think about transitioning from a POSH policy which recognizes women as complainant to having a gender inclusive POSH policy? And how do we go about it? So these are the basics of what we are going to talk about today. At any point, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. But in the end, we will have some time for question and answers also, in case you want to save it for then. But if not, you can always put it in the chat box and I'll keep a track of if somebody has asked anything. So first, what is a gender inclusive POSH policy, right? As Anshul rightly said, it's applicable to all employees regardless of all genders. You made a very interesting point with respect to who is an employee in that case who's recognized under POSH policy, right? If we are saying that it's applicable to all employees, would you want to expand on that further?
Sure. So as per as per the POSH policy right now, the scope is quite wide, right? Anybody who comes into contact with the organization regarding the organization's work is covered under the scope of the policy. But there's like a caveat to that, right? Where the complainant is only a woman, and it's the complainant's referred to as the aggrieved woman. Now it's interesting why that is. So in 2013, when after the recommendations were in and the law got passed, we were still at that point, we wanted to ensure that women had full access and had that access to the law, because when you look at larger context, women do not have the same access as men when it comes to law. So the law was created to protect a historically marginalized group. But what has happened is, and one had hoped in 2013 that with the passage of time, we will widen our scope of historically marginalized. And that has not happened. Even with decriminalizing Section 377, we've not seen where else we can take these conversations, especially to our POSH law. So in a gender inclusive POSH policy, when we look at employees, we do not want to specify the gender of the aggrieved person, right? Because very often we say, okay, men, women, or trans persons, we're still limiting it, and it still refers to a very binary understanding of gender, where you have men, women, and then as per the law, as you call it, the third gender. But because gender in our existing context is such a nuanced concept, right? It's no longer a spectrum. It's no longer with men and women on the other side and then everyone in between. When we do gender trainings, we define gender as a galaxy, right? Where you have these multiple gender identities existing simultaneously in this universe that we have. So we make this recommendation to organizations is to not specify or give a list of genders, because that is still limiting, that is still exclusive. And because it's such an evolving concept, you cannot edit your policy every now and then, right? So we say that inclusive of all genders, right? It is applicable to all employees, like you rightly said, regardless of genders. Or we say be of any gender, even, sometimes they want to use different terms. And then we specify that this covers both complainants and respondents.
So before we move on, there's a question that Jyoti has asked: is there any law based on men's harassment in India? So right now, so we will come to that. First of all, when we say a gender inclusive policy, right, people do have to realize that not only is it for women and trans persons and non-binary folks or people who identify with any other gender identity, but it is also for men. As of today, there is no law that deals with men's sexual harassment or any kind of sexual misconduct that happens with men in workplaces or otherwise. In penal law, there are some provisions, but those are not specifically applicable to workplaces. So even for men, a gender a policy that only recognizes women as complainants is not enough. right? Because you're also leaving out a big chunk of people who identify as men. So men don't have protection under the traditional POSH policies that we have. Hence, having a gender inclusive POSH policy is not only inclusive towards people from, let's say, transgender persons or non-binary persons, but it's also inclusive towards men. When you make a policy inclusive, it becomes inclusive for all. It makes sure that it brings into the fold everyone who is there within an organization, not just a certain specific the Transgender Persons Protection Act is there, but specifically with respect to workplace sexual harassment, there are the laws fall short. Since, the fact that the Transgender Persons Protection Act also has only a limited scope. So when companies have to build their policies, they still need to expand the scope based on, the law is the bare minimum. So think of it as like the base of what you want to make. And after that, you keep adding on the good things that you want the policy to have. That's the same thing that applies to a POSH policy, which is gender inclusive, right? So it is beneficial not just to persons who fall under the transgender persons umbrella, but also for men, right? So because it takes care of all genders. And it is applicable to all employees, which means it leaves no one out of the conversation. It does not, as Anchal said, it is not recommended that organizations list out the genders of people to whom it is applicable. Just keep it neutral in the sense that you say that it is applicable to any aggrieved person within the organization, whatever may be their gender. Anchal, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, in fact, very often when we're making the case for a gender inclusive POSH policy, we use the gaps in law as the starting point in our conversation. Like right now, we have Section 377 that talks about non-consensual sexual activity between people, and that covers men as well. And right now, we're undergoing revisions for the Indian Penal Code, and apparently that stands to be cancelled. So going forth, it may be so that men have no protection under the legal system. So what we put forth, what we have the conversation with organizations is that at an organizational level, then what is it that one can do to make sure that the workplace experience is safe for all persons? Because when you go towards the law, it's far more complex, and going forth, there may be no protection, right? So we do not want to create a space where you need to go outside to resolve workplace issues. The point of the IC is to resolve the issue within the organization itself. But at the same time, it is important to flag that in cases where, say, the harassment does require legal intervention, it is important to flag in the policy itself that very often we are limited by what legal coverage is available. So at an organizational level, this is what the policy can do, because the law very specifically caters to women. So it's important to mention that, like we always mention that in the policy, that this is what legally is there. At an organizational level, this is what we can provide, and this is where our limitations are.
Correct. So the idea is that when you are giving women the opportunity to address their grievances within the organization, they're able to bring up their concerns within an organization, they're able to have them addressed in a timely manner without having to invest any kind of money or have it done in a confidential manner. Why are we not giving the same sort of accommodation or opportunity to people of other genders, right? Of course, again, traditionally, because women were the ones who were recognized as the marginalized group that needed to be addressed under the law was created that way. However, the landscape in terms of the conversation with regards to workplace safety is changing. So the law may not change as fast as the culture in corporates is changing, and hence organizations need to sort of fill in that gap, and then law may catch up later. That's the hope.
Yes.
Now, looking at this example that's there on the screen, the complainant is a gay man who has faced an incident of verbal sexual harassment. The respondent, also a man, has made comments about the complainant's sex life. So, complainant does not feel safe in the workplace any longer and wants to quit. a man who is gay, everybody is aware of his sexual orientation, has faced some incident of workplace sexual harassment where another man has said something about his sex life, which is something which is extremely private, right? And he wants to file a complaint with the organization. Let's say that this organization does not have a gender inclusive POSH policy. What do you think is going to be the impact on this person's psychological safety going forward? How is this person going to feel being in this workplace where he feels that his concerns cannot be addressed in the most efficient manner, or that he is at the mercy of the HR folks or the manager, as Anshul pointed out? So, if that is, say, a person in this situation, what do you think would be going through their mind at this time? What are the emotions that they are going through in terms of their psychological safety? Please feel free to chime in the chat box. Put yourselves in the shoes of a person who does not have a remedy or does not have a forum or does not have the right recourse when they are in a situation like this. First of all, this person, we can only assume, has felt comfortable or felt safe enough, or assume that the place was safe enough to be able to be their own selves, right? To actually be out of the closet. Okay. Can I unmute? Jyoti, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. For the, especially with the transgender, okay, I had recently spoken to one HR, okay, and he was hired because company wanted to have implement entire LGBTQ in the system.
Correct.
Poor fellow, okay, so he's very comfortable with certain dress code, kurta pajama, but instead of the CEO asked him to follow a strict dress code. So from there it started, and every day he used to call me and say, I cannot survive because I feel I'm being judged every day. There
Right.
was a lot of, even there was a suicidal Radha, but somewhere, I think after 6 months of fight, he left. So there was no belongingness there. Definitely, Rituja, what you said is absolutely correct.
That's
Uh,
um sorry, Jyoti. Can I continue?
please.
Yes. So that's the picking up on what Jyoti said, right? There starts to be a sense of I joined this organization thinking it's a safe space. But now I'm not seeing that being put into action. I do not feel good being myself, being who I am, and being just navigating my life as any other person within the organization, simply because I come from a specific either gender identity or sexual orientation. So that resentment also comes from a place of feeling unsafe, feeling uncomfortable, constantly feeling like you never know what is the next thing you might have to face. Any person in this situation will not be feeling, will not feel comfortable enough, or will not feel productive. Productivity is going to dip, and at the end of the day they might quit. Like Jyoti said, in that situation, the person, he just quit because he no longer feels like he can be a part of this organization. And this is a big issue. A lot of organizations focus on hiring people from marginalized communities, but do not do the groundwork when it comes to making sure that they feel safe within the organization. And a part of this groundwork is making sure that you have gender inclusive POSH policies. And Anupama says the person would lose a sense of their identity, which is so true, right? Just being yourself cannot be something that puts you as a target of people within the organization who feel that they can get away with sexually harassing someone. So there are many, many instances like this where people feel the need to be able to go up to someone and just have their queries addressed in a proper manner, but do not find the support from organizations. So when we are talking about a gender inclusive POSH policy, we have to make sure that, we are thinking about these people. Where is this need coming from? What is this policy that is required? Whenever we are thinking about it, think about these scenarios that play out. Right now, you are not familiar with any of these scenarios simply because most people are not talking about it openly, since they do not think that the organization is a safe space. Hence, it's important that a policy which is applicable to all employees, regardless of their gender, is curated within the organization. Anjali was saying something.
Yeah, it's also, I was just thinking, it's also a matter of like two things, right? It's also a matter of rights. As employees, what rights do we have and who do we extend those rights to? And that is very, very important when you talk about feeling belonged, right? Here, the complainant here is very clear that, maybe they do not have the rights to go up and complain and have that matter resolved, addressed. And it's very, very important to, when we think about rights and extending that across the entire organization. And I was going to say something and I lost track, but it was along the lines of what you were saying, but let me come back to that in a bit.
All right. So just to summarize, what is a gender inclusive POSH policies? Expand the scope of your POSH policy to reach every person within the organization, whatever may be their gender. Give them the same accommodations that you give, let's say, to women as of date. Give them the same accommodations. Logistically, people are going to then say that, oh, but what will happen to the volume of complaints that will come in? Will it work out? Will it not work out? I can tell you factually, even if you expand the scope of the policy, factually, the most number of cases that are filed are by women. But that does not mean that there is no need. There is a need. And if tomorrow, let's say there's a case where the complainant is not a woman, they are not left remediless, right? So hence, we have to recognize that this is where the world is going when we are talking about having a gender inclusive workplace. Now, we have spoken in bits and pieces about the need for having a gender inclusive POSH policy, right? One thing we have emphasized on a lot is that it builds a sense of belongingness. I think organizations do not see or do not recognize very obviously what the feeling of belongingness can do for their employees. I have seen organizations that really focus on how the employee is feeling when they are at work, which then leads to a higher rate of retention, higher productivity. People do not want to move out of the organization. They do not want to quit because the culture is not working for them. So sense of belongingness, very, very powerful. Helps efficiently address concerns related to workplace safety. So anyone who's feeling like, I may have an issue is not left remediless, like we spoke about, and encourages a culture of speaking up and zero tolerance, right? There are organizations that say, oh, we don't have any complaints. And large organizations with a considerable workforce say that we don't have any complaints. I don't think that's a good thing necessarily. It just means that people are not comfortable or they're not feeling safe to come out and say what it is that they are facing, or they're not feeling comfortable admitting that there's a problem, right? So speaking up, very important if you want to make sure that your employees are feeling safe and want to be a part of your organization. They will speak up because they feel that they can. And zero tolerance. As an organization, it is your responsibility to put your foot down and say, look, this is what goes, this is what does not go. We have zero tolerance for any kind of behavior which is harassing in nature, right? So to be able to drive that, you also need to be able to follow it up with action. And if you're saying we have zero tolerance for sexual harassment, then it should be zero tolerance for sexual harassment for all, not just for women, right? Anshul, you want to add something?
Yeah, it very often, this also becomes like a compliance thing. So I'll give you an example. One of the organizations that we were working with, they were really far ahead in their conversations on inclusion around gender and sexuality, and we drafted this policy for them. that spoke about gender inclusion, spoke about the whole process of coming out at work. How does one navigate that? What are some things to keep in mind? What does it legally look like? For example, with trans persons, even if you've not got your name legally changed at an organization level, what are the provisions we could provide? All of this, right? So it was this really nice, comprehensive policy that we've charted for them. And then we look at their POSH policy, right? And then it's not matching, because you have this one policy that is talking about inclusion that's so far ahead of the curve, but your POSH policy is not matching up. So we sort of like did the how do you say, we came like sort of backwards, right? We traced our way back, and we realized that now what are the policies that are not reflecting this inclusion. And POSH policy became that one point we identified that it is very gender specific and it's not reflecting your larger commitment to inclusion. And suddenly we realized that a lot of other organizations, well, there are very robust inclusion policies, what needs to be done is identify where it's not reflecting, and you'll see gender specific POSH policies are a big place where you can start reflecting your inclusion policies.
That's true. A lot of organizations do proudly state that they are committed to DEI within the workplace, and they are committed to, the advancement of LGBTQI plus persons within the organization, and yet do not want to adopt gender inclusive POSH policies. If there are any concerns related to compliance, right? Because the law does say that the complainant has to be an aggrieved woman. Let me just clarify it at this juncture that if you expand the scope from the complainant being an aggrieved woman to an aggrieved person of any gender, it is not going to hinder your compliance requirements. You have already fulfilled the compliance requirements. You're just going over and above that. So there's not going to be any issue with respect to compliance. If you have a commitment towards DEI within the organization, your POSH policy also needs to match the, as Anshul rightly said, it needs to match the commitment that you're making to DEI. Right? So this is a big loophole when people talk about workplace inclusion. So having identified the need for workplace POSH policies that are gender inclusive, when is the right time to implement a gender inclusive POSH policy in an organization? I get this a lot because organizations, small organizations will say, oh, we are just, oh, just curious. Anupama is asking, just curious, why is the scope not expanded to all genders in the law? So Anupama, traditionally, as we said, women have been recognized as a marginalized group when it comes to any laws with respect to sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and other bodily harm as well. So when we are talking about any incidents of this nature, typically the laws have a gender slant because most complaints are by women. Even statistically, if you look at it, most complaints are by women. So it's just assumed that only women can face these issues. That's not true. The law does not recognize that, okay, it may be the majority of complainants are women, but that does not make it so that no other person of any other gender will face an incident of workplace sexual harassment, right? So hence, the law has not caught up yet. It still has a gender slant. There's work being done, but I don't know how long it will take since it took from Bhavri Devi to the act itself, it took so many years. I think it was like 19 years of, waiting for the act to come into force. We don't know when the amendment will actually take place. So the law, unfortunately, at the moment does not encapsulate the realities of our society. So yeah.
And
Sorry.
also, I mean, initially, right, when the committee sat in to do their research, and there were some conversations around the neutrality or the inclusion bit of all genders, there was I have to say, there was a certain fear that came, right? Because we looked at who can access law and legal mechanisms for their rights slash advantage. And it was seen that for women, due to literacy levels, due to access to public spaces, it was seen that their access to law was far lesser compared to men. So it was seen that if the law is made inclusive, it might so happen that it will get skewed, right, where men will use the law a lot more, and it may not truly address the issues that came up address the issues that formed the context for the law coming into the first place. So in order to, it was almost as an affirmative action, right? It was an affirmative conscious choice to make the law very gender specific, to ensure that women affirmatively can access the law more, and the legal system's not bogged down by either ingenuine complaints that come in from men very often to hinder women's access to spaces, laws, and rights. So while that was great for that time, now, like Ruth just brought up, workplace composition is changing increasingly, where our list of marginalized genders has grown, right? And increasingly, men are realizing the need for spaces to complain and seek redressal within an organization. So, like she rightly brought up, it is time we revisit the law, but just want to put in, because a lot of us are very confused, like why in the first place, right? And there was a very specific context into which the law came to be so specific.
Correct. Also, someone has asked a question, M. Chaudhary. In case of litigation, will the complaint be maintainable under POSH law as it's limited to women and trans women? The thing is that since we have very little precedent of saying what will happen in a court, I really can't give you a concrete answer right now. There's only one judgment where they rejected the appeal filed by the complainant simply because they, I think it was a man and he was not a woman. So the court said the scope will not be expanded to someone who is not a woman. So unfortunately, as of today, I don't think I can give you the right answer. Only one case judgment has come up where they have said that they will not expand the scope to include any other gender other than a woman. So maybe in litigation, it may not stand. That is why it is even more important for companies to invest in policies, because at least within the organization, you will be able to address the concerns, if not outside in a court of law. Going back to if there is any right time or wrong time to adopt a gender inclusive policy, right? Small organizations say, or like organizations that are just starting up say that, oh, we are just starting up. Do we really need to make it gender inclusive at this juncture? And large organizations who have a legacy, who have been around for a long time say that, oh, this is how things have been for so long. Do we really need to ruffle the feathers and change things when things have been going fine? Do we really need to make a transition? The thing is that simply because you have not had a complaint so far does not mean, one, that there is no complaint, or second, that there will be no complaint in the future. Maybe because you don't have a system in place is why you are not hearing about it. There is no faith, there's no trust of a person who's not a woman. Let's say a man wants to file a complaint, but he knows that there is no place to file this complaint, or it will not be taken in the same manner, or it will not be dealt in the same sensitive manner like it will be of a woman's complaint. He is not speaking up, which is why you're not feeling the need as of now. But there may be so many complaints that may come up tomorrow when you open the avenue for having an open conversation like this. Maybe tomorrow, all the people who've been waiting to speak up might start speaking. And you also have to be prepared for the future, right? If you are an organization who's just starting to build your POSH policy, you need to be prepared for any contingency that may happen later, because changing it later is going to be another task. Might as well prepare yourself and make your policies as expansive as possible to begin with, so that you don't have to do this exercise later. There is no wrong time. Honestly, the time was yesterday for organizations to have adopted gender inclusive POSH policies, but there is no wrong time. You can always pick it up no matter what juncture you are in terms of your DEI journey. Anjali, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I feel like you said, there's literally, it's never too late. I feel for a lot of organizations, they feel it's too late. And if there's going to be any sort of retrospectively, might people pick this up as an issue that why didn't you have this for so long? So there's definitely no wrong time, but I feel like um, even as organizations, particularly who are starting their conversations on DEI and are looking at inclusion, in fact, they are, and often they wonder, like, where do we begin? And your POSH policy could be a great place to start, to give you that impetus, try it out with the POSH policy. What are some struggles you're facing when talking about inclusion here, when looking at how do you talk about gender in a more nuanced sense? Your POSH policy can be a great place to start with, because once it's that thing, right? Like when you're thinking about a very big task and you're constantly wondering how and where do I begin, and the task keeps getting delayed. So I've very often told organizations that, why don't you treat the POSH policy, because you already have a policy. What you're looking at is moving things around within the policy to make it inclusive, and you could do that with several policies across. So test it out with the POSH policy. In fact, you're at a great advantage because there's so much work done around this already. Multiple organizations, consultants, organizations, POSH organizations like Outcast have done work around that we sort of have like a template, right, to get us started on that journey. So test it out with that. In fact, I would say best time to work on a gender inclusive POSH policy is when you're starting your DEI conversations.
Also, the buy-in for POSH is easy, right? Nobody is going to say that workplace sexual harassment is a non-issue.
Yeah.
Everybody universally agrees that workplace sexual harassment is an issue which directly affects the productivity and safety of a person, whoever is an employee, right? So nobody is going to say, no, we don't want more people to be safe. It's the best place to start, as you said, Anshul, because nobody is going to deny someone their right to safety.
Yeah.
Start with your
And infrastructurally, you don't need to change much at all, right? You're literally changing the wording of the policy to expand its scope, right? Your IC is remaining the same. All these other infrastructural things you've put in place for POSH literally remain the same. You're of course changing the policy, perhaps change some of the outreach and posters that are going out, and that's about it. So it's a very realistic thing to do as well, and like you said, the buy-in is already there.
Correct. So how do we go about it, right? So now we have said that, okay, look, this is where our starting point is going to be. We have made up our mind that we want to change our POSH policy to become more gender inclusive. If you are still unsure of how it will be received, even though this is not necessary, just do a pulse survey. Do an anonymous pulse survey within your organization to get the pulse of where the conversation is when we are talking about workplace safety, and how are people feeling about it. Whether do they recognize the need for it? Do they not? Is there enough sensitization about it? Is there not? All of these insights you will get from a pulse survey. The pulse survey can then be read into understanding what is it that we need to work on along with the POSH policies scope being expanded. Maybe people are recognizing that some cases might come, but they are not as serious because, that level of sensitization is not there, or they just simply do not know because there's a level of ignorance. So do a pulse survey, get to understand what is going through everyone's minds if you want to have that added level of comfort before taking a leap. Very, very important, pair it with awareness and sensitization efforts. If you are bringing about a change in your policies, especially one like this, you need to be able to invest your time and efforts in making sure that everyone is on board and understands why this is a need, right? You need to be able to build trust with your employees and tell them that, look, if we are going to have a gender inclusive POSH policy, this is where the need has come up from. Like the conversation we are having today, you need to have it further with your stakeholders, with your employees, with everyone who's going to be covered under the scope of this policy. So they know the need has now come and they are all on board. And of course, there has to be a level of sensitization that goes in, right? If you are making it inclusive and you're making sure that everyone is being given the opportunity to be a part of the conversation, then they have to be able to have that conversation in a safe manner. If there is a complaint file, I know it is confidential, but everyone here knows how confidentiality works in organizations. Sensitization efforts have to be made tomorrow. Let's say the example of the gay man. If tomorrow someone finds out that a person is gay and they have filed a POSH complaint, the general workforce needs to have a level of sensitivity to be able to understand where he's coming from, what his issues are, why it is incorrect or it is not something which is acceptable to discuss the sex life of a person simply because they are from a different sexual orientation. So all of these sensitization efforts also need to be taken care of. Of course, Rome was not built in a day. You will have to do it slowly. You may have some resistance in the beginning, but that's where change begins from. Without resistance, there's not going to be any real change. Some people may fully change their mind. Some people may take really long to change their mind. Some people may never change their mind. And that's also okay. You have to be okay with all the possibilities, but you have to keep making those efforts, especially if they're driven by the organization. People are more likely to engage with them instead of, waiting for some person to be able to drive this conversation and then it coming through the organization. If organization drives it, there's a little bit of a more higher credibility to this conversation. So efforts from organizations with respect to awareness and sensitization, very important. And have open conversations and allow room for doubt clarification. I think Anshul and I can both tell you that when we are doing sensitization sessions for POSH, no matter for what topic or, just generally, people are scared of asking questions because they think that, oh, can I ask this question? Is it a dumb question? Is this question going to offend someone? Is this something that I can actually ask? And it's not going to look like I am homophobic or I have an issue with something. So you need to create those spaces. You need to create dialogue. You need to create spaces where people are able to go and ask their questions. There are no wrong questions, right? But there are right people to answer the questions. So you need to find the people who will be able to answer those questions with a level of patience, with a level of understanding that where it is coming from. So get people to come and have these conversations with your team members, simply to make sure that you are able to say that, look, it's not just some policy which is being deployed. You also have an opportunity to have an open conversation with us. Anjali was saying something.
Yeah, with regard to asking questions also, right? We've seen when there's this concept of, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room might relate to this, is this walking on eggshells. So very often when you do POSH trainings, women come up to us and say that men start acting as if they have to walk around eggshells around you. They can't have a conversation with you at all. They leave you out of group chats because they think anything they might say might make you afraid. So there's this isolation that happens, and which is also not good. That's also actually harassment, right? When you isolate a certain individual because of their gender identity, it is harassment behavior. Now, why that is happening is because there's some amount of gap that's existing. And it is good practice to be mindful of what you're saying at the workplace, but we're treating this mindfulness as fear. We're seeing this mindfulness as fear. And very often, because frequent spaces for conversation do not happen. Now, this is with cisgendered persons, right? When we talk about persons from the LGBTQI community, this walking on eggshell behavior it's multiplied. And how, right? Where because people fear that they may offend, they just don't talk to somebody who may be out in the open. So can we create, as organizational leaders, can we create those spaces where even if questions that may be dumb, may be seen as silly or may be seen as potentially offensive, there is a place to put those questions, there is a place to address those fears and concerns and have a healthy conversation around it. And that can't happen unless somebody who's trained in that specific space is trained with leading those conversations, and more importantly, very often somebody who's external who
Correct.
comes to lead those conversations. Because if it's internal, I'll say, oh, my HR head is going to hold this against me, right? So if there's somebody external, the stakes are reduced and I'm far more comfortable to ask questions then.
Also, I feel like it's unfair to put the burden on people who are in the margins to be able to answer these questions. They are not here to answer questions. They are here to do their job. So get experts to talk to people about what this change is and why we are bringing it in, instead of leaving, let's say, LGBTQI folks to answer to why the policy is being changed. So no problem if you want to, take it slow, but at least make sure you're doing it right. Having said that, take these few steps when you are transitioning or starting out with a gender inclusive policy. Now, having decided that we want to go through with the gender inclusive policy, we know how to go through with it. The question arises is, what is the difference between gender neutral and gender inclusive? I know a lot of you have seen people talk about gender neutral policies, right? What gender neutral means? Let's look at the terms themselves. Neutrality. Neutrality is when we assume a neutral stance regarding someone's gender. And we say that all genders, the gender does not matter, and that we will proceed as if there is no gender. And then gender inclusivity. Gender inclusivity is where you recognize that different genders come from different lived realities. They have different issues that they face. They have different things that they have to worry about when they are talking about workplace safety. They have different concerns, right? So you're not just saying, I don't see gender. You are saying, I see gender and I recognize the difference between the lived experiences of different genders. Gender inclusive policies, while they are not applicable, while they are applicable to everyone regardless of their gender, the way they have to be implemented has to be gender inclusive, right? To drive this point, what I'd like to do at this point is just look at your screen and you will see an example. Complainant has delayed filing a POSH complaint beyond 90 days and wants the IC to grant them an extension. So as we know, 90 days is what is been given to you, and you have additional 90 days wherein you can make an application to the IC to extend the time limit. And they say that they had concerns about coming forward and filing a complaint. Let's look at it from three perspectives. First is a cis woman. So a woman wanted to file a complaint, but she could not come forward earlier because of some reasons. What could be her reasons? An effeminate heterosexual man. So a straight man, but someone who has maybe a little more effeminate manner than what is considered masculine. So let's say he has some feminine traits that he's displaying, but he's still straight. He has a wife and kids at home, but he's an effeminate straight man and a non-binary person, right? So all three people, let's put ourselves in the shoes of these three people. What could be the concerns why these people would not coming forward? You can use the chat box or you can unmute yourself. Why would a woman not come forward if she's facing an incident of workplace sexual harassment? What could possibly delay her? What fears? Please feel free to unmute or you can also write in the chat.
Fear of retaliation.
Fear of retaliation. Okay. Fair. Hostility, retaliation.
There
Maybe.
can be fear of judgment as well. And in case they won't have that trust in the policy and the system, probably they would have,
Correct. So maybe
different fears.
a lack of trust in the policy and the system. So hence they are fearing that, they may not get the right recourse. They are probably also fearing that they may be judged. Now look at it from the point of a straight man. A man wants to file a complaint, but he was not able to because he had some concerns. What could these concerns be for a man? If a man were to file a complaint of workplace sexual harassment, what is the typical reaction that they anticipate? Anshul, you want to take this?
Very often it's just not taken seriously, right? Typically when men face attention from someone, whether it's welcome or unwelcome, it's seen like a boisterous thing, like, oh, what are you complaining about? Like, revel in the attention. So it's not taken seriously. If it's from a woman, let's say the complainant's a woman, then to definitely, like, it becomes like a thing to brag and nobody really takes it seriously. Versus when, if let's say the complainant is a man, and as a respondent, and you're a heterosexual man, it's instantly assumed, especially in this case, because the expression is a bit more effeminate. There's instinct assumptions made about your own sexuality.
Correct.
And that might actually be a huge deterrent
Yes.
from filing the complaint in the first place, because one may think that, what, I can actually deal with the harassment probably. You start surveilling your behavior. Maybe I could avoid going there. Maybe I could request to be put on it. Like, I would rather do this than people have assumptions about my sexuality. And again, what does that say about the organization's culture? So just having the neutral POSH policy is not enough. There's a lot of work on organizational culture that's needed here.
Correct. So simply because a man is filing a complaint, some might assume he's gay. Also because he has effeminate manners. So you just make assumptions about his sexual orientation, which means that the efforts to make sure that people are aware of the conversation are also not happening. The other thing is that what if this extends to the body who is going to take up my complaint? What if they are also not sensitized? What if the IC themselves do not know what to do with a complaint which is coming from a man? What if they laugh at me while they take up my complaint, right? So all of these concerns are very real, and a man does feel shame a lot of times when he has to go and file a complaint. Those are not addressed by a gender neutral policy. Simply saying we don't care about your gender is not enough. You still have to care that he's a man and he may have had faced these issues while coming up and filing a complaint. Same goes for a non-binary person. They may feel that I'm not able to file a complaint because is the IC even aware what a non-binary gender identity is? Do they do they at least have a level of awareness and sensitization to deal with my lived realities? My identity, I don't know if I'll be misgendered. I don't know if my identity will be dismissed during this entire process. Would they know how my gender is playing into the incident of sexual harassment that I'm facing? So all of these questions are going to come up, and your IC needs to be trained to understand how different genders will experience workplace sexual harassment, and they need to be sensitized. This is another step which is very important when we are talking about an inclusive POSH policy. It's not only just making it neutral towards the gender of the person, but making the systems inclusive, making the systems aware and sensitized towards how this is going to play out in real life. So this is basically with respect to the difference between neutrality and gender inclusion. I was reading up, I keep reading up on different perspectives about neutrality versus inclusivity. And I did read something by Page Hall Smith. The aim of this policy is not to render gender invisible or to establish some new norm that pronounces the superiority of gender neutrality. Rather, its intent is to encourage us to examine how our assumptions about gender inform our research, designs, methods, samples, analysis, and language. So while we say that we want to address everyone's concerns in an effective manner, we also cannot assume the position that their gender does not matter. Gender matters, and we need to take into account everybody's gender when, especially when we are talking about inquiries which come under a POSH policy, and have a level of sensitivity towards the gender of the person. So this is what we wanted to speak to you about today. Anshul, you have any closing words?
I think we've covered quite a whole lot, and so I'm going to keep it very brief. Is that when we talk about inclusion, I feel it's very helpful if we can take a step back, zoom out a bit, and see the way we want to understand it, and then implement it across various organizational levels, right? With regard to POSH policy, working on redefining the scope, redefining who the aggrieved person is, who the complainant is a great place to start. But can we step back, zoom out, and see what else is needed to be done to ensure that the access to the policy is truly inclusive, right? Does everybody know about the policy? Do they feel equipped enough to access the policy? Do they truly understand the nuances of the policy? And more than anything else, we do want to ensure that those that are most marginalized in the organization feel confident and have enough faith in the process, in the policy itself, to truly use it to realize their rights. So I feel like that is the continuing conversation. And I understand that's a whole separate session that we can do as a follow-up, Rituja. But I really want to end on that note, that while this is a great starting point, we don't want to end our conversations here. And I hope this has been like a good initiation for all of us present on this call.
Thank you so much, Aanchal. I think that's a very nice way to capture it, right? That this is only the starting point when we talk about DEI and creating an inclusive workplace environment, which is truly safe, where people feel like they belong, and goes a long way in making sure that whoever comes into our workplace feels like themselves. So that was the intent of the conversation today. Thank you so much, Aanchal, for joining us, and thank you all of you for being such a patient audience. We will be putting this up on the YouTube channel of the Outcast Collective, so you can rewatch it in case you want to just go through it, or you want to share it with your colleagues or friends, and they can also go through it. You can find us, both Aanchal and I, on LinkedIn, and you can also find the Outcast Collective on LinkedIn as well as Instagram and Twitter. If there's anything else, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Aanchal, you can drop your email in the chat box, and mine, it will be on your screen here. So if you want to take a screenshot, you can take a screenshot of this. Please feel free to reach out to either of us. Thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.